Hi, everyone, and welcome to our webinar, How MSPs Can Use ZTNA to Simplify Adherence to CIS Critical Security Controls. Before I pass it over to our speakers, I just want to remind everybody that we do have a dedicated Q&A section at the end of our webinar, but feel free to drop any questions you might have throughout. We want to try to make this as interactive as possible. Matt, I'll let you go in and introduce yourself.
Yeah, so Matt Lee, I'm a recovering MSP, I guess the best way to describe it, and I am employed by PAX8 as Senior Director of Security and Compliance and do most of my days doing either SME work, like working in CSA ZTNA or CIS type work, or doing webinars and things like this every day. So I appreciate y'all having me here. We'll have some great conversations about CIS today.
Rui, do you want to go and introduce yourself?
My name is Rui Lopez. I am a manager of a very dedicated team here at Checkpoint on SASE. We work a lot on solution design, implementation, use case scenarios, and we are here to ensure the technical success of SASE POCs in our customer base.
Cool. Good to be with everyone today. I will say I'm a big Matt Lee fanboy. I've watched a lot of Matt's webinars in the past, so I'm super excited to be on with him today as well as Ruby.
Oh man.
Yeah, no, this is a treat, but it's good to see everyone. My name is Justin Ryle. I'm our head of alliances for what was Perimeter 1, now Harmony SASE under Checkpoint. Been with the business for about 4 years in the MSP ecosystem for the entirety of my career with the vendor side under multiple roles. So yeah, looking forward to diving into the content today. Cool. I'm going to just kick us off with just a quick anecdotal story. We've got a lot of content to share and a good discussion ahead of us, so I don't want to take too much time here, but just give it a little bit of the background around Perimeter 1, now Harmony SASE again, how we got to this point in terms of our mapping with CIS, which we think is super important. Actually began about almost a year and a half ago. So at that time, we were hosting some of the vendor peer groups in the ecosystem, and I was doing some of the presentations on the quarterly lunch and learns, and was in a group of awesome MSPs, giving them information, the value proposition of our solution, and talking about our partnerships in the ecosystem. And I thought I was doing great. And the facilitator injected and said, "Hey, how do you guys map to CIS controls?" To be honest, it threw me for a loop. I was aware of CIS, but I had not dug into great detail. So I walked away from that session, really starting to turn the wheels around how we talk to partners, right? What are these frameworks that they're using, that you're using in the ecosystem to make educated decisions on the portfolio that you're bringing to your customers, right? And I think about that as I go to shows on the road and I'm looking at all the booths. There's a sea of vendors out there, so many solutions. So it's not only from a technical perspective, but the business perspective. How do I translate these products down to my customers? What framework am I using for this? Even into profitability, right? If there's bloat and I'm using a lot of tools, maybe in one group, a CSC or implementation group, and potentially there's ways to divest. In my learnings and my research, there were so many ways we could look at this. And I know Matt's done a lot of work in this area as well as Rui, so I'm excited about the webinar. But yeah, I took that feedback to our team, and a huge shout out to Jim DiLorenzo and Boaz Avogat, our product marketing team. And they took that and really drove that forward to help us look at our solution and how we align to the overall CIS framework, the different implementation groups, and then share that with a market in whole. So I think this is really the first webinar we've done focused on CIS. And yeah, super excited about it. So Matt, a bit long-winded. I'll shut up there and pass it over to you. I know you're going to share something a little bit separate.
Yeah, I'm super happy actually just to see the nerds in the crowd that heard CIS and decided like this was the best use of their time today. So welcome. Thank you so much for being here. That's awesome.
Definitely.
The other thing I'd add in too is like you're not alone. As a vendor, nobody had done this work, Justin. Like I'm blown away that this had never really been done. People build and sell products that serve a purpose and basically get shaped by the demands of the consumer versus what it costs to meet that demand. and that's it. And they don't think about like what part of the security function am I serving? Like, and that's just not the way it's looked at. So I applaud you for going down that path. As my thought as a practitioner, you talked about several things it solves. One is, what tool do I need to use to solve this? Like, how do I even solve this to meet these safeguards? It's helpful if you've already done some of that thought work, as Rui and we're going to surface today. And then the second aspect is like, as I use this, what are the gaps I'm missing? What are those things that I'm not doing? And even as a product team, how do I change Perimeter 81 and Checkpoint and Harmony SASE to meet more of these needs? And how do I help service those more? So anyways, I think it's a great and valiant effort, and I've taken up a minute of our time already to get started. So what do we want to do? Let's go ahead and look through how you think we map, and we'll just talk through it so everybody can go. Rui, do you just want to present them, and then we'll just kind of make your argument of what their value is, and then we'll dig into the safeguards and just switch back and forth? Does that work for you?
Yes, we can do it. Should we do it from the?
So it looks like the first one, if we go to the next slide, says that you say you help service 5.1, and you list a facilitates. So what are your thoughts on that? Help me understand that. What's 5.1 and how do you help?
Well, our facilitation comes from the fact that we were just discussing that before the session. Our approach to SASE is in essence, delivering a combination of connectivity and security as a service. So forgetting or not putting the focus on the cloud aspect of it, but we want to combine connectivity and security in a way that can be delivered as a service. But we know that we're replacing something. Then what we're replacing is a sort of, if not hardware-centric, when we think about legacy VPN, at least site-centric approach of that combination of cloud and connectivity. And that's why we are so focused on user. We're focused on user and identity.
Yeah, so 100%, Rui. One of the things I think of, so just 5.1 is establish and maintain an inventory of accounts. And you don't actually do that because there's external identity providers. There's external storage of that in a list where I say, that's Justin and he works here at Checkpoint, and that's Ashley and she works here at Checkpoint, right? That's a list that someone maintains, but you do facilitate that, right? Because you bring that data back and you can facilitate that data. I do want to tackle something else you said, which is that this is, as you look at SASE or Secure Access Service Edge, if anybody's defining at home, right? As you're looking at this kind of shift of networking, it's probably very important we talk about that before we go through these safeguards, which is, if you look at CIS safeguards, they were built in a world of local network, having a castle and a moat and the traditional method of office, and then this like thing called a pandemic or something happened and we all got shoved at home. And so we have this much more modern definition. And to your point, Rui, we're shifting it to a more identity control plane and an identity centrism. And that identity extends into cloud apps. I just spent an hour last week talking with Meryl Fernando at Microsoft as a principal program manager, talking about Entra and how it makes such a shift to that identity. So I do agree with that. And if we want to let me share my screen real quick, I'm going to go ahead and say yes and share screen. That one. All right. If we look at Control 5.1, which is the first safeguard that y'all dig into, it just basically says have a list of an inventory of accounts, right? And so it needs to store the name, the username, start, stop dates, departments. Well, that's not typically an IDP, right? Because you're going to delete the user when that goes away. So this is mostly served by an Excel sheet. And I think you're accurate in saying that it is a facilitator, meaning that you're bringing data there. So why don't we shift into some of the other things that I think you guys work well with, which is controls, what, 6. What do we want to look at real quick?
It's also a facilitator, and I want to highlight this.
Yeah, please do.
It's a facilitator by default in the sense that when you get signed into through the IDP to have access to a particular network resource, that's when we see it on our inventory on our end.
Yeah.
And we see more than user. We see the user and the association to the particular device that they're using, because we allow a number of devices to be used concurrently by the same user. But yeah, if they are on our end, it's because they have access to some kind of network resource, and that's how they end up in our inventory. So that
makes total sense.
Great
clarification. All right, so you're facilitating my data that I need for 5.1 because you're using the IDP and adding a layer of data to it from that perspective. 5, if I want to make sure people understand, CIS Control 5 in IAAA, so IAAA, identity, right, authentication, authorization, and auditing. Control 5 is all about the authentication. It's all about the identity and the authentication. Five is where those meet, right? 5 is. 6 is about what should Matt Lee have access to, right? And at PAX 8, it should be very little. I should have very little access to things at PAX 8 because I'm an external resource and I spend most of my time doing education and SME work. But when we go to your big world here is 6.3, 6.4, 6.5, which I like to call those the MFA rules. Those are what are driving a lot of this need for SASE. It's what's driving a lot of the need for people to move away from the traditional VPN too, is like, where all does that apply? Require MFA for externally exposed applications, require MFA for remote network access, require MFA for administrative access. It gets a lot easier if you only allow access from an edge, like a SASE edge. Isn't that right, Rui? Like, is that the argument here of why you're serving that partiality?
Exactly. And we're replacing a lot of work that is done in legacy VPN in every point of access, or even in every VPN gateway, in case there are several, to have to manage that access control and shifting that access control to the SASE network, because that will be respected across every tunnel that connects to internal resources that we want the users to access. So it makes it much easier to configure, and it makes it really identity centric, because because your identity source may not be provided in every edge gateway that you connect to the SASE network. You might be using different vendors. You might be using local databases on one end and the like, right? If we centralize it on the SASE network, you're truly identity centric.
Yeah, and in some ways it helps you bridge gap some of those sporadic identity providers. So think about it, like if you had Active Directory not hybridized to Azure Active Directory, and you had maybe a local database inside of a SQL server running on a line of business application. Those are all segmented delineations of identity that if you put some kind of access layer on top of it, whatever it may be, I'm not saying this is 100% a vote for you, I just mean in general from a SASE perspective, you're adding this additional control plane layer as the means of access to those, right? At an identity layer and per application by specificity, right? As you start seeing this play out, you could potentially say you have access to this or not that, things of that nature. So when we look at 6.5, just if everybody can see my screen real quick, 6.5 says, provide MFA for all admin access accounts, right? So you now can put layers and say, hey, in order to access conditional access for this Microsoft admin function, you need to come from this IP address or behind this type of VPN endpoint, right? As a methodology of control. And for doing that, it's what y'all are doing as well. And then in other places where you can tie in as an IDP, you then service that. Is that correct, Rui? Or are you guys mostly network centric at this time in that regard?
Both.
Both.
And actually, a common use case is also to be able to introduce MFA or to add MFA to internal resources that don't natively support it.
Yep. Well, let's look at that, because here we go. Inventory 2, 3, 4, and 5, right? So 3, we have require MFA on all externally exposed applications. And then let's dig into what you just said, which is like for remote network access, which would mean to those internal applications, right? To that regard. And also you can add it to internal applications even when you're local, right? Because you could put that granularization, you could segment that out, you could put in those things. And what we're really talking about when you do this is principle of least privilege, right, Rui? That's what we're really getting down to as well. Not just the MFA state, but also the way we apply principles of least privilege, saying, hey, if Ashley doesn't need access to that application, let's not give her access to that. If Matt Lee doesn't need access to that application, he shouldn't have access to that. And so what you're doing is creating your access control layer separate from your identity plane. And that might be a choice you make as a security professional to say, I'll let Matt and his security team manage the identity in Entra, my identity provider, and then I'll get people into macro groups based on classifications, but I'll let Rui's team manage the access control to various applications. I now have created separations of duties as well that makes it have to have 2 collusions between Matt and Rui to create a user or give access to things, right? To that nature, you have this a little bit of separation of duties created there. But 6.3, 6.4, and then 6.3, this is one that I just really want to hone in on, because it says put MFA in front of all externally exposed applications. What is a SaaS application? Is that not externally exposed by its very nature, right? I mean, it's external to that SaaS provider, but it's external to you as well. And it's available ubiquitously. And so I think the point we're making is, if somebody can touch it from the outside world without other controls in place, then I need MFA on that. And I think, isn't that pretty much the argument of why you'd add a SASE layer, is to be able to extend that to those things as well?
The MFA, and the other argument with what we call IP lock, right? The ability, because you have a gateway that can have through which the users and the groups can access and contact that SaaS application, being able to not only do MFA, but even if you have all the means to authenticate, if you're not connected from the SASE gateway, if you're utilizing other means to get to that SaaS application, you won't get through because you're not contacting the SaaS application through the gateway IP, to the SASE gateway IP, that is.
And it's working with the way the infrastructure exists today, right? It's a great means to say, and I want to make sure I've codified what you're saying. If I only have this one gateway, and let's say it's IP 10.10.10.10, just to make this simple for us. I know that's not publicly routable. I'm sorry, y'all, but I'm just saying it that way. But let's pretend 10.10.10.10 is only accessible if Matt and Justin are in the right group. And now when I sign in, I get access to that gateway. And now when I access this application, it's coming from that IP address. And therefore, it is allowed at that application's consumption end. There's a rule set in that application, whether it be Microsoft conditional access, whether it be whatever it may be, saying that this IP is where you must come from. And if Matt's not in that group, then Matt doesn't get that access, right? Because I don't have access to that IP, therefore I can't send out of that IP. Is that essentially what you're saying from a tactical,
yes, and that
operational
is
perspective?
Completely separate from the MFA side of things, right?
Correct. Yeah.
We call it an added layer for that reason.
But it's a byproduct of access control, right? What I mean by that is if the first A is authentication, and that's Matt, and that's what MFA really speaks towards, right, is authentication. It can speak towards authorization, especially when you speak of like ABAC, which ABAC stands for attribute-based access control, where you're now saying, is that the right machine? Those things could be parts and functions of the authentication mechanism, right? So there's still some degree of that playing out. But otherwise, it's mostly access control playing out right there, right? This is authorization at play. And when you've made a decision to say Matt has been authenticated correctly, he's coming from MFA, and now you're saying, hey, Matt is authorized to access that application, then that IP address you're creating is an additional authorization layer that exists before the application that you have created. So it's a byproduct of the authorization mechanism you're creating. Is that a fair statement?
Correct. And it's so easy to. What would be the way to implement it? That's why we're so big on the legacy VPN replacement. What is the alternative way on the legacy VPN world of implementing this? It's getting all your traffic through your gateway.
Twice, right? Because you have to bring it into the building and egress it, right? And ask me how I know that's a problem, right? So you have this this real challenge in that speed of play, and that's why I've moved people to cloud gateways, cloud edges, and that's essentially what we're talking about here, right? Is moving it where the resources are plentiful instead of where the resources are non-plentiful and expensive and non-redundant.
It's that policy, that ZTNA policy level too. I'll just add in real quick. I mean, once they're authenticated in MFA, you know, we've got those individuals in, and they can access, say they've got access to a certain application through that IP. You know, that's where that ZTNA story around we automatically deny everything. So just because you're authenticated, if you're not included in a group or as an individual access to that, you're not getting in. So whoever that is, whoever's administrating that network, whether it's Matt or Rui, can go ahead and set those policies. So that's another even layer of additional protection that we're bringing.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, you're making a control plane before having access to things, right, Justin? And you're in this kind of default denial. So when you start thinking about ZTNA or zero trust network architecture, especially for modern applications, that's exactly what you're talking about, is saying, no, if you don't need access to it, if you don't, then I'm not going to give you access to it. Even if you are authenticated, if you're not in the appropriate groups and need authorization for this, then you don't have authorization. So yeah, 100% agreed. All right, what else we got? So we've beat the heck out of Control 6 for authorization. And really, I want to make sure it's landing for people. Like if you shift to a ZTNA type approach, you start to redefine what is a network. You start to redefine where you can apply identity, authentication, and authorization control planes, right? It starts to redefine that and centralize it, make it significantly better. The other pieces we didn't cover here is 5.6 and 6.7. 6.7 says centralize access control, right? And that's what you're doing in effect, right? Is this ability to centralize access control into one control plane. Okay, what's next? Let's see it, Rui. I'll stop sharing here.
Which in itself, I just want to add a note to that one. It's a mind shift. Because we get asked a lot when we're doing implementing POCs and when we're doing running actual deployments. Oh, do I have to the security controls that I have in place and the role-based access control? Do I have to replicate that across the authorizations that I have across the tunnels that I implement through the SASE network? And the answer is no. You're looking to centralize, right?
Yeah.
You're
Yeah.
looking to abstract from having to replicate that and just manage
You're
it
making that the core point. Yeah. And remember, another key point too is centralized doesn't always just mean one place, right? And you see this replicated in the safeguards several times. Centralized where possible, centralized where supported. But it does mean don't have 50 control planes, get down to 1 and 2 if you have to, right? And so to your point though, Rui, if you can shift that to one control plane and start to think that way, you stop caring about point-based solutions as much, you stop caring about where my assets are as much, and you start becoming much more like the decentralized world we live in a lot of ways, right? So you're centralizing your access control and decentralizing the other assets and resources to some extent. So yeah.
Right. And you're much more equipped for this world, right? This new
Yeah.
reality.
100%. All right, so we know we've agreed on 6 in this understanding of the shift of where MFA and control plane, 6.8 RBAC, really 6.8 even ABAC as a conversation, and 6.7 for centralization. So let's look at what's next. I think 10 is
Yeah,
where
10.1.
y'all kind of live, right? Ashley, go ahead.
Yeah, it's 10.1 and 10.2.
Okay, so we don't have to shift back for 10.1 and 10.2. The argument is this. When you start looking at control 10, control 10.1 says apply anti-malware, right? Deploy and maintain anti-malware software. A lot of people think of this as the endpoint only. And what they don't realize is when you're talking about this, all enterprise assets, well, what is all enterprise assets, Professor Matt? Well, all enterprise assets includes end user devices, IoT devices, network devices, servers, mobile, portable, right? That's a lot of stuff. Okay, and so we often only apply 10.1 to the one stuffs we think of, which is that endpoint. We often don't even think of the mobile phone, but we certainly don't think about the network device and that traditional castle and moat layer, but also that layer of looking for bad stuff happening on Rui's machine, right? And so in that regard, where do you think you fit into that, Rui, in being a SASE edge? Help me understand this.
Well, one of the primary use cases we fit in and have a differentiation on is the fact that we can actually bring the threat prevention stack over to the endpoint and happening on device. So for the agent-based access, which is typically the widest coverage of the SASE use cases.
Of course it is. Yeah.
One of the things that we differentiate in is because the threat prevention services don't need to happen at the gateway.
Right.
They don't stop happening when you're bypassing the gateway for some reason, right? We all know that SASE is a business, to put it simply, business of latency, right? The point of presence, how close the point of presence is.
Sure.
Are you gonna the user experience, the digital experience monitoring, and all of that comes from the fact that most SASE providers rely on the gateway to do traffic inspection and deliver malware protection, and others.
When you've got tons of processing power and point of use shifting to the point of consumption, right? And the host.
Exactly.
I agree with that statement. I think you have to not miss the network aspects of that too. I do think you have to look for that traffic at the network layer as well as the host. But I would agree with you, 10.1 is a host-centric model. And if you're shifting to the host as a method of this, as part of that same agent for the SASE endpoint, then I would agree that that is a proper application of this from a partiality perspective.
Today, we're mostly shifted on that on-device aspect because it allows us to rely less for security purpose on the dependency to the gateway. So today, if you
scale and speed. Yeah,
exactly.
Totally.
If you want to do split tunneling, you're not bypassing security by doing split tunneling. But where we're going at, and this is kind of a roadmap item that we're going to deliver at the end of until the end of the year, is the flexibility. So to be able to do it on device,
collection at both points,
exactly.
Which will help you more statutorily meet some of the 13 as well as some of the 8 extensivity. I do believe that
yes.
10, and IoT, all of those things, right, to that statement. Okay, we've beat up 10 a little bit. The point being, really, you have to be doing anti-malware. And I would agree, Rui. I have this statement that says, there's never been a single breach that didn't happen on a host asset that should have been managed. And the reason I say that is, what is an asset? An asset is something that has the ability to store or process data, as we've seen in 1.1. Well, guess what? If it had the ability and I compromised it and stole data from you, it should have been an asset you were tracking and managing. And I think this comes to that argument of, 10.1, the shift to the host, and Phyllis Lee at CIS says your network ends where your user's fingertips land, right? And as you think about that definition, it means you have to move to host-based methodologies for collection in a lot of cases. So I agree with that. All right, 12. So you're getting into this 12 is all about network management. And maybe this is probably the most salacious use of the mapping, right? This is probably where you are kind of redefining network infrastructure management. Help me understand your belief in your support of 12.1 for network infrastructures up to date, 12.2, because you're not managing my network infrastructure at the office, are you? Right? You're not doing that as a function. So how do you
Exactly.
work? How does this help? Help me understand it.
Exactly. And because you're delivering that combination of connectivity and security as a service, it's up to the SASE provider to keep the infrastructure up to date. That everything that is new that you build into the security stack, or you can build into connectivity, extending the points of presence network is an example to that, right? It's an example of being of shifting how you look at 12.1. Your
That's right.
infrastructure being up to date may mean just adding another point of presence that makes your network, your latency lower and more availability, right?
You were in and out. So I'm going to try to Matt words
Oh,
this.
sorry.
No, it's all right. You were cutting in and out. Was that just me, or did everybody else see it as well? Ashley and Justin?
Yeah, you were a little in and out, but
Okay.
it's
All
clear
right.
now. Yeah.
I think we got it. So the point is, and this is actually supported in the safeguard. So if everybody can see my screen right now, anytime we use gray in this visualization, it's because example language has been used. In this case, example implementations was the word that was used for this. And there were two given. One is to keep my network equipment up to date. I could run the most updated software. But thank you, John Madden. Perfect. That is a slam dunk. Got you. Yes, I can update my software. But the other alternative given is using currently supported network as a service offerings. And when you start thinking about that, that is inclusive, not just of your Meraki's and your network, physical network service offerings, but in my mind, it would also be inclusive of if I am encapsulating and wrapping the traffic between me and the endpoint of the network, then I am obfuscating from that network in most ways how I'm dealing with that. And if I'm doing it at the host level and I have control of that, then in my mind, it makes a lot of sense that you would say you're keeping it up to date because you're now changing what is a network. And I like to say, and I actually specifically went to Starbucks just for this purpose, but my Starbucks cup here is an example of that. Are you meaning to tell me, Ashley, when you go work at Starbucks, that somebody's going to come behind and go, I need to make sure that 12.1 shows that Starbucks Wi-Fi access points were up to date this week, and we need logs for... No, but if you wrap it in a SASE platform, I also don't care in the same regard. I'm now riding over a different network stack from that regard. Now, there's some arguments. People might throw bricks at me for that statement here in the audience, and I'd love to chat about it. Put your comments down below. But it does change that. Okay, Rui, back to you on that for 12.
So I was just going to give a really near close use case to SASE of what it means to keep the network up to date. For example, every time we're extending the SASE network globally or the global backbone with another point of presence that could be of use to a customer that has a set of workers or a new office in that region, we're updating the network, right? Without it, and we redefine.
Well, and you own that,
control means.
Rui. Like you own that from a shared responsibility matrix. I'm not going to sit there and go, man, has Checkpoint been keeping this up to date? If you're not, that's table stakes. So I think that's the point of a network as a service offering, Rui, is that you better be doing that, right? Is keeping these points of presence up to date. And I love that. That's what the point of why you do this for us, right, is the argument. The other thing I wanted to dig into in 12 is 12.2 is talking about having SASE and defined principles of least privilege. That's very much what we're doing. 12.2 says in your network design, and now we're thinking about this new version of the network, we need to talk about segmentation. Well, hell, micro segmentation is what's happening. Now you're getting down to say this application is allowed access to or not based on this identity, right? Is that a fair statement, Rui? Is that you're getting into even more micro segmentation?
That's what we call in our world firewall as a service. That's those components.
Makes sense.
That firewall as a service.
And same thing Justin said earlier about principle of least privilege. You're now actually denying by default and only giving access when access is granted. And so you're by that default talking about POLP in this conversation. And then availability, Rui, that's your points of presence conversation. Having all these variable POPs to have me be able to access in various different orgs and spaces, but still meeting my compliance needs that I have for that is very viable, right? And so that's the beauty of that methodology. So
also being able to utilize several gateway instances to provide redundant tunnels to the internal resources, right? Because you can have a functioning POP, but if your IPsec tunnel to your private resources goes down, you have to be able to provide redundancy to that too. So
Yeah.
that aspect exists.
Both sides, yeah, where you're creating at least one half of the puzzle, an extra redundancy to that side, right? So that point, even for those legacy access methodologies. Okay, also thinking about 12.3, it says use securely manage your network infrastructure. Well, HTTPS, I'm assuming we're using TLS and HTTPS to access your platform and make
Yes.
changes. Okay, solved. 12.3 done. And then 12.4 network architecture diagrams. This goes back to if you're talking about the redefinition of this TLS based or VPN SASE edge based methodology, it's all being done as the diagram as it's being drawn in that regard, right? And so I'm assuming you're making an argument that this is the network, and by that definition it is the network diagram. Is that the argument of visualization of that?
Correct. And that's
Yeah,
very
makes
visible
sense.
in our dashboard.
And it even shows those gateways and legacy endpoints too, right? To that extent as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And the status. And we
Okay.
can monitor the status of those stuff.
One more set of controls and we'll let y'all out. We're probably already past time. Ashley, do we need to get the hook or we want to knock out 13 real quick?
We're 1 minute over time. So if you go over
Okay.
13
Let's knock
quickly.
it out.
Yeah. I think
All
we're
right.
good.
Okay. Anybody still sticking around? I love you. I appreciate it. We'll go over 13. So now you're getting into 13.4, traffic filtering between segments, right? 13 really gets into the security of network, and it is very focused on the legacy model of this, right? The traditional, this net VLAN has access to that VLAN, but we're really kind of redefining that as well, but also now being that middle point, traffic filtering between networks. Help me understand this, Rui, real quick.
Yeah,
Or Justin.
We can segment based on access levels inside the same network, and we can go up a stage in segmentation and creating several different segmented networks in the same tenant. So you allow what we call micro segmentation, right? But you can
Yep.
segment completely different separate networks inside the same tenant, which may be
Nice.
connected or not.
And with different IPs as an external point so that you can make externalization more possible, right? That's the point of this, is you can actually give them different exit points that allow you to set other filtering on third-party things that are outside of your control based on those exit points, right? So that's the other aspect of this, yeah.
Yes.
Okay, fantastic, great
Goes back,
clarification.
yeah, the firewall as a service, this is all the topology of that and all that flow and the IPs and the interconnection is all very visible in our UI as well to that point.
Yeah, it's a great point to call out CIS. There was a question in the crowd from Jim asking, hey, listen, are we seeing small to mid-sized businesses adopting CIS as a framework? And if you guys don't mind, I'll answer that one question real quick because it's valuable.
Absolutely.
The thought is this: you're starting to see more and more people adopt frameworks, period. And that might mean ACSC with Essential 8. That might mean, NCSC and Canada's extensibility with CAF or in Canadian side of things, or it might be US, right? And NIST, a CSF. What you're seeing is a lot of people adopting those. And the challenge is a lot of those frameworks are not very pragmatic or prescriptive. They typically are these grandiose, thou shalt establish identity controls. Thou shalt establish authorization to networks. And you're like, great. What does that mean, bro? And so a lot of people are finding that the pragmatism of the prescriptiveness of CIS combined with, if you go to cisecurity.org, it has mappings to every other framework. I like to say CIS is the how to those others what, right? This is the recipe book of how you should go about doing access control. Like maybe you should have a list and maybe you should get rid of that whenever people go away, and maybe you should review this and maybe you should, and then those tie into those whats that are given out as a governance. So I think one way or the other, people find themselves in CIS land as extensibility of how they meet those other safeguards, if that answers that well. So yes.
Is it also too, Matt, that it provides a roadmap because CIS builds upon each? So if I'm an MSP, some of these frameworks, right, give you different directions, and maybe I can jump towards a specific implementation. But with CIS, as I understand it, I could be incorrect. You're the expert. You build, so you start at one, right, and then you incrementally build upon that, and it sort of pulls back that natural reaction and say, hey, I want to go to whatever the sexiest thing is, whether it's pen testing or these maybe advanced items, but I just got to start with the basics.
You nailed it. Well, and look at it right here. The first thing, the only IG1, so implementation group 1 in 12 is keep your stuff up to date, right? Buried entry is make sure you can patch your stuff. That'd be number 1, right? Let's start there. It doesn't get back till the second pass. Once you've gone through the rest of 18, 1 through 12 again, to be back there for implementation group 2 before it says, hey, maybe you should secure this better and have better segmentation and have, so just under your point, it gives people 56 things to do first, then come back and do the others, right? And it's built that way. And don't get stuck if you're a practitioner, because when Phyllis Lee said why they added in those groups like that, implementation groups, it's because even enterprises got stuck trying to implement things at 3 in the harder sets of control 3 rather than moving on to 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, right? And so it really is to do exactly that, Justin. It gives you a ramp. It also starts to lend itself towards basic hygiene being the first group, next step, and next step. So you tend to have like this natural place for a ball to fall on segmentation of your stack, right? Your, silver, gold, bronze, whatever, bronze, silver, gold stack. It lets you have those buckets to fall in. And so you put your more mature people up that need SOC and SIM. Well, that's 13.1. Well, there are no IG1s in 13. It's only 13.1 that starts saying, hey, maybe we should have a SIM, right? That's the first time you get into log correlation and analysis is 13.1. Well, that's an IG2. Why? Well, because you might want to have your stuff actually secured and all the stuff deployed first before you start collecting it and doing stuff with it. That might be valuable. Anyways, yeah, great question. So I hope that answers it for anybody watching or listening still today. And back to their point, so 13.4 is talking about traffic filtering, and it's for any traffic sent through you, right? Like anybody and that goes to this point of, the more and more you start adopting this type of a platform and the more and more you require to go through there, the more and more you can say data can't be touched unless I go through this platform. And in this platform, things are filtered, right? And so you start making very good arguments that the more you lock down ZT and your edges to SASE only, then you can start making arguments saying, no, that isn't an asset. Why? Because it didn't have the ability to store or process data. Why not? Because it didn't come through the SASE edge and couldn't authenticate. Like, that's why I don't need to track. So you can see where having a deep SASE adherence can change things. Rui, you look like a man who wants to say something. Let's go.
No, I was gonna say I never thought about it that way, but I'm definitely gonna use that one. That's absolutely.
It's an argument.
We're so focused on being flexible, right? Allowing.
Yep.
We don't need to go full tunnel. We allow the split tunneling. We allow you to keep the performance, and that we don't think about that when you go full tunnel, or that's kind of technical.
If you allow anything to be accessed over public internet, then you have said I have no control over what the asset is.
Exactly.
Right?
And
like
that's
the point.
Your asset. It becomes your definition of an asset, or the one you recognize as such, right?
And I've made this argument before. The safeguard says that you need to keep an asset inventory of devices that have the potential to store or process data. And so what I'm saying is, why would I want to boil the ocean when I could rather target what has the potential to store or process data and be very strict about what that is and when that is, right? Like even in my former days at Iconic, I made that decision to say, hey, guess what? If you sign in, Mr. Sales Director, into our cloud applications, you're going to get sucked into MAM. I'm going to take over your computer. I'm going to deploy my tools. And the first minute I get Nick Nyberg running up to me going, Matt, I need my computer back. I can't play this video game. Sentinel-1 stopping it. Well, you shouldn't have signed in from there. I told you I was going to take control of it, because I took an approach to say, if you're going to touch data, you're now an asset. And if you're now an asset, I must do these things to you. Well, now you're just taking and using SASE as that edge point of control to say, if I can't control it everywhere at the identity plane, I'll move the identity and authorization plane, and I'll say that I'll take control of it at the authorization plane.
You have to move the data through me. Otherwise, you're not
That's the way I would approach it today. Whether that be, and I want to distinguish real quick for anybody that stayed on, must be the nerdiest of nerds. That's why you're here still. Is that as you start thinking about what is ZTNA in its definition, you want to go read 800-207, special publication 800-207, written by a lot of smart folks, one of those being Kindervog and Garbus. The future in my mind of where ZTNA goes is mutual TLS brokerage, right? Where you're not even worried about full encapsulation. You're saying for these SASE services, you can only access through a TLS session that I'm going to stand up for you from the policy enforcement point after receiving a secure, single packet authorization, or SPA, that allows me to have all this information about whether or not I open that port up for authentication, allow you to move forward. But the point is, today, this is the way I would approach this, right? Is from an encapsulation type methodology is the best way to solve this today, until the rest of the world and infrastructure catch up to making that a viable possibility for consumption. So anyways, figured we'd go a little extra nerdy there for a sec. Any questions in the audience? So there's 20 something of y'all still hanging out. So what do we got? Nice to see everybody.
I haven't seen any other questions, but
either that good or that dumb. So it's one of the two. I'm hoping it's the former, not the latter.
I know we are 10 minutes over, so we can probably go and wrap up if that works for you guys.
Yep.
Awesome. Well, thank you all for joining today and taking time out of your Monday to hang out with us. And thank you again, Matt Lee, for being our special guest star for this webinar. Sounds like we definitely need to do more of these.
Thank you, everybody, for joining.
Thanks so
Thanks.
much. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you for your time.